Be forewarned, the following narrative dives into grim depictions of historical occurrences and medical conditions that some may find unsettling. Viewer discretion is advised. The magistrate's voice echoed powerfully within the crowded courthouse in Salem, Massachusetts, demanding silence and order. As the ambient whispers of the onlookers dwindled, a palpable tension filled the air. Entering through the main doors, a 60-year-old woman named Bridget Bishop was ushered in by two men gripping her arms tightly. The scene unfolded on June 2, 1692, with Mrs. Bishop standing accused of a crime that struck terror in the heart of the Puritan world: witchcraft. The second she crossed the threshold of the courtroom, the hushed silence disintegrated into chaos. A 12-year-old girl, Ann Putnam, one of her main accusers, emitted an ear-splitting cry and began to wail. She, in chorus with 4 other young girls present, asserted that the elderly woman had cast a spell upon them.
They fervently claimed that even within the confines of that very room, the spirit, her specter, of Bridget Bishop was tormenting them, cruelly pinching their arms and nipping at their skin. As the magistrates commenced their interrogation of Mrs. Bishop, her alleged victims launched into a disturbing display. These young girls pulled at their hair and groaned as if in unbearable pain.
They gestured wildly toward the ceiling rafters, insisting that demonic familiars, known as imps, were perched there, aiding the supposed witch. The townsfolk gathered there reacted with a collective gasp, when suddenly Ann Putnam toppled backward, appearing to be thrust by an imperceptible force. They were perplexed and horrified by the dark power that the woman seemed to command. They believed that a mere look from Mrs.
Bishop had the power to send Anne spiraling into uncontrollable fits on the floor. In an effort to establish her connection to these events, the court's bailiff compelled Mrs. Bishop to undergo a touch test. He pulled her toward the convulsing Anne, under the belief that the touch of a witch would dispel her own enchantment. The moment Bridget Bishop's hand touched Anne's forehead, the young girl's eyes snapped open, her convulsions stopping abruptly.
She appeared, before all present, to have been miraculously cured. This astonishing spectacle further reinforced the belief in Bishop's guilt in the court's and public's eyes. This did not prevent additional witnesses from stepping forward to recount their own eerie visions involving Mrs. Bishop. Some narrated tales of her specter appearing to them in the dead of night, strangling them with invisible hands. After a deliberation process that merely seemed a formality, the court reached a verdict.
Bridget Bishop was condemned for witchcraft. 8 days later, she was taken to Gallows Hill and executed by hanging, before a crowd that erupted into cheers. The haunting visions of witches and demons, as recounted by Ann Putnam and others, would eventually lead to the execution of 19 more innocent individuals in Salem. However, it is exceedingly unlikely that any person in that paranoid little town had genuinely conspired with the devil.
In reality, it is conceivable that the people of Salem, accusers and accused alike, were afflicted by a common condition, a devastating neurological disorder triggered by a fungal infection called ergot. When our bodies falter, we place our trust in the institutions of our era for answers. But occasionally, those institutions, be they medical or judicial, encounter a mystery that eludes their understanding, turning the situation into a high-stakes guessing game. Join us on this exploration. In this particular analysis, we delve into a contentious and fascinating medical theory surrounding one of the most notorious events in history, the Salem Witch Trials. While fear and hysteria in Salem were undoubtedly exacerbated by the psychological phenomenon known as mass hysteria, this episode embarks on exploring a different, perhaps more insidious, physical explanation. There exists a notion which posits that an insidious toxic fungus infiltrated the town's food supply, unseen, sparking the strange symptoms and frightening hallucinations experienced by those deemed bewitched. This conjecture goes further, proposing that this same toxin might have clouded the judgment of magistrates and jurors, leading them to unfairly sentence 19 innocent souls to their deaths. The haunting ordeal that swept through the town of Salem, Massachusetts in the year 1692 is widely believed to have ignited within the residence of Reverend Samuel Parris. It all began with his 9-year-old daughter, Elizabeth Parris. This young girl started suffering from peculiar, invisible distress. She described sensations akin to being bitten and pinched, which soon escalated into forceful, writhing convulsions and terrifying visions. Not long after her ordeal commenced, other young women in the town began showing the same bizarre and alarming symptoms. When urged to reveal the cause of her distress, Elizabeth asserted she knew who was at fault. It was the clandestine and malevolent craft of 3 local women, allegedly witches dwelling amongst them. This singular, incendiary accusation ignited a wallow storm of paranoia and blame that engulfed the entire township. Over the ensuing year, the deeply religious Puritan settlers would go on to charge over 200 of their neighbors, companions, and kin with the crime of witchcraft. Ultimately, the court found 19 of those men and women guilty, and they faced execution by hanging. For centuries, scholars have hotly debated the core question: what compelled this steadfast, tightly knit community to so abruptly turn upon itself? To some, the explanation lies in psychology. They cited a phenomenon known as conversion disorder, or more familiarly, mass hysteria. This is where a society under extreme duress collectively embraces irrational concepts, which can morph into perilous shared delusions manifesting as genuine physical symptoms. Other, more skeptical historians have contended that the symptoms were nothing but pure fabrications. They argued that Elizabeth Parris, Ann Putnam, and their fellow so-called afflicted girls fabricated their stories of torment by witches, perhaps as a perverse method to garner attention and wield influence in a tightly patriarchal society that afforded them none. Yet, in 1976, an investigator by the name of Linda Caparoyle from Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute found these standard theories lacking credibility. She contended that in most recorded instances of mass conversion disorder, the affected individuals typically share a common set of compulsions or symptoms. For instance, during historic dancing plagues, the shared symptom was an uncontrollable urge to dance. However, in Salem, ailments varied significantly from one person to another. Certain victims cursed with bewitchment experienced violent fits and spasms. Others were plagued with severe mental disarray and memory lapses. Still others claimed ghostly apparitions physically choked or assaulted them. There was a striking absence of clinical uniformity among the accusers. Dr. Caparoyle also believed that the notion of an entirely psychological illness could not adequately account for the tremendously vivid and often collective hallucinations that the Salem accusers reported experiencing within the courtroom. Moreover, though witch trials did occur historically in colonial New England, none escalated to the wild scale of mass hysteria that distinctly marked Salem. Typically, one individual was tried and punished in these cases. Never before had such a widespread frenzy accused hundreds in a cascading panic. Finally, Dr. Caporeale found it implausible that the young girls had orchestrated their afflictions as mere deception. Accounts from 1692 consistently highlighted the terrifying intensity of the girls' symptoms. For the entire calamity to merely be a pretense would have required a collusion of countless young girls, some as young as 9, to meticulously choreograph and maintain award-worthy performances over an extended period. Their dramatized fits, their contorted bodies, and their sorrowful admissions had to be so convincingly real that they swayed the wisest and most esteemed individuals in New England, leading to the execution of 19 community members. However, Limba Coral speculated that what was deemed as supernatural possession might actually have a physical origin, perhaps a biological factor overlooked by historians for close to 3 centuries. In April of 1976, she introduced a groundbreaking publication.
Within it, she proposed a bold assertion. The residents of Salem had indeed been poisoned, but rather than a mystical foe, the true antagonist was an ancient and earthly menace, a fungus named Claviceps purpurea, often referred to as ergot. This parasitic fungus predominantly affects wild grasses, but thrives especially well on cultivated grains, including wheat, barley, and most notably, rye. Humans have recognized its potent and peculiar characteristics for thousands of years. An ancient Egyptian document from 1100
CE references it. An Assyrian clay tablet dating back to 600 BCE remarks on its harmful emergence in grain ears. A manuscript from Central Asia, around 350 BCE, vividly describes it as a menacing grass, causing pregnant women to miscarry and succumb during childbirth. The fungus commences its subtle life process as its airborne spores settle on flowering rye heads. It infiltrates the plant and, over time, develops into a hard, darkish purple knob known as a sclerotium, replacing what would have been healthy grain. These fungal growths can reach up to the dimensions of a small coin. To an uninitiated observer, these dark sclerotia can appear astonishingly similar to regular grain, complicating their detection and removal during harvest. In fact, prior to the 18th century, many farmers believed these darkened grains were merely sun-bleached parts.
Consequently, while gathering their harvest, they unintentionally collected ergot as well. Once the contaminated grain was milled into flour, the toxic mold was ground along with it, and the poison became an ingredient in the daily bread of the entire populace. The compounds produced by ergot can be deadly. Ergot contains an intense group of organic substances known as alkaloids. Alkaloids are naturally occurring chemical compounds with the capability to bind to protein receptors in human cells. Many alkaloids provide benefits and serve as key components in essential medicines. For instance, morphine, a robust analgesic, originates from the poppy plant, while quinine, used to combat malaria, is derived from the bark of the cinchona tree. When alkaloids engage with a cell, they trigger responses that can significantly modify or even destroy cell functions. However, the alkaloids found in the ergot fungus are highly toxic to both humans and animals. Large doses can gravely impair the human body's circulatory and central nervous systems, leading to the debilitating disease known as ergotism. Dr. Caporeale's core argument suggested that the documented ergotism symptoms bore an uncanny resemblance to the afflictions described by the accusers during the Salem Witch Trials. Consider, for issue, the account of the initial afflicted young girl, Elizabeth Caris. She notoriously reported that unseen entities were incessantly biting and pinching her. While the Puritans interpreted this as demonic activity, Caporeale proposed that a particular ergot alkaloid, ergopeptine, could well have been responsible.
Ergopeptines are a potent chemical compound that triggers a dramatic constriction of blood vessels throughout the body, a phenomenon that medical professionals refer to as vasoconstriction. This process drastically reduces blood flow to all areas, but it is especially critical for the fragile nerve cells in our skin, which need a continuous and stable supply of oxygen and nutrients to function correctly. When this essential flow is disrupted, even momentarily, those nerve cells begin to malfunction, sending an avalanche of jumbled and erratic signals to the brain. We have all felt a mild version of this, when, for example, sitting awkwardly or placing a heavy load on a leg too long, cutting off circulation and causing the prickly sensation we know as pins and needles. This tingling acts like an internal alarm, a signal from the nerves urging us to move and restore proper blood flow. Dr. Caparel proposed that Elizabeth Parris and other afflicted girls might have experienced a similar, but far more intense, sensation. Their torment stemmed not from physical pressure, but from a chemical cause. A toxin was squeezing their blood vessels from within, affecting their entire bodies simultaneously and creating a relentless, invisible torture of pinching, pricking, and biting. The understanding of such vasoconstrictive effects of ergot is far from new. It has been known, to some extent, for centuries. A Chinese manuscript dating back to the 12th century BCE characterized ergot as a medicinal herb, particularly highlighting its role in childbirth. Its ability to contract blood vessels was utilized to prevent excessive blood loss postpartum. However, these potent effects were not always advantageous. In severe, unregulated cases of ergot poisoning, blood vessels constrict so fiercely that circulation can be permanently halted to certain body parts. Tissue deprived of a steady supply of oxygen and vital nutrients begins to perish, leading to a gruesome condition known as gangrene.
During the Middle Ages in Europe, this gangrenous form of ergotism claimed countless lives. One of the earliest and most catastrophic occurrences was recorded in France's Aquitaine region during 944. Here, rye was a dietary staple for the impoverished. The previous year had been abnormally damp, creating an ideal environment for ergot spores to flourish and invade the harvest.
The afflicted grain, peppered with the insidious ergot kernels, was ground into flour and baked into the daily bread consumed across the region. Only days after ingesting the toxic provisions, the French peasantry began reporting distressing symptoms, an overwhelming fatigue coupled with waves of nausea, followed by an intense, creeping sensation of tingling or burning in their hands and feet. This agonizing condition garnered the disease its infamous moniker, holy fire. As the tainted grain traveled from rural farms to busier urban areas, the disease spread alongside it. Thousands throughout southern France soon reported the tormenting symptoms of the holy fire, all while unwittingly consuming the very toxic bread causing their decline, dosing themselves with increasing amounts of these lethal ergopeptines at each meal. In the direst of cases, blood flow ceased entirely to affected tissues, with fingers and toes being especially at risk due to their dependence on fine, delicate blood vessels. The gut, where the ergopeptines are first absorbed, suffered serious damage from their intense concentrations. Patients suffering from what was then known as ergotism often found themselves unable to eat or digest their meals properly. This condition took an even greater toll on bodies that were already frail from illness. Back in medieval times, the healers, who had no grasp of the true nature of this ailment, made desperate attempts to treat it using traditional herbal solutions, like tea made from elderberry flowers. Herbalists believed that these flowers could ease inflammation, often used to combat symptoms of colds and flu. However, Against the potent venom of erotism, such remedies were completely and utterly powerless. In the absence of effective treatments, the patients' bellies would swell ominously as their blood-deprived intestines began to perish. This gruesome process, known as necrosis, would then claim the skin, fat, and muscles as they too began to decay. Bacteria would thrive on this dead flesh, eventually spreading the infection throughout the entire body. Between the years 944 and 945, this singular wave of erotism resulted in a tragic loss of 20,000 lives, wiping out roughly half of Aquitaine's inhabitants. Many who emerged on the other side of this nightmare found themselves missing an arm or a leg. In the 10th century, devoid of any knowledge about fungal toxins, Europeans grappled to find an explanation for this terror, known as the Holy Fire. The intellectuals of the time were convinced that this and many other illnesses were caused by miasma, malodorous air that emanated from soggy, decaying swamps. This theory seemed reasonable, particularly because another deadly affliction, malaria, was prevalent in those swampy areas. Others, especially the common folks and the clergy, believed the symptoms of ergotism were far more ominous, perhaps a direct punishment from the devil himself. Those who were afflicted with the disease, they reasoned, must have been sinners in desperate need of atonement for their concealed transgressions. Yet, amidst all these fascinating ideas about bad air and demonic punishment, no one suspected that their true tormentor lay in the very grain they toiled so hard to harvest.
In the subsequent year, 945, the weather turned much drier. Ergot could not spread that season. Gradually, as the months went on, the infected grain from the previous harvest was depleted and replaced by a new, uncontaminated crop. As mysteriously as it had emerged, the disease vanished. Yet this relief was short-lived. Roughly 40 years later, after another unusually wet summer, the holy fire returned with a fierce vengeance. This time, it cut down nearly 40,000 lives, twice the toll of the dreaded previous outbreak. Those who lived through this catastrophe documented their harrowing experiences in horrifying, vivid clarity. One such account described, "The bodies shriveled. The skin stretched tightly over bones was a sickly color. The afflicted suffered unbearable pain. They experienced convulsions.
Ultimately, the flesh was consumed and blackened like coal, succumbing to gangrene and decay in such a horrifying way that the limbs emitted an awful stench and detached from the body." These terrifying outbreaks plagued Europe for centuries, becoming devastatingly frequent, particularly in the humid, temperate regions of France and Germany, which were ideal for the cultivation of rye and the ergot that preyed upon it. Despite this, no one had any understanding of what truly caused the holy fire, let alone any notion of how to cure it. Struggling against an unseen, recurring threat, many could do nothing but turn to divine intervention for answers. By the end of the 900s, ergot poisoning, better known in Europe as the Holy Fire, had already claimed the lives of countless individuals, from the humblest peasants to the wealthiest lords. Those who did manage to survive often had to cope with the loss of their limbs to gangrene. The populace was desperate for any sign of a remedy, any shard of hope they could grasp. Due to the influence of one particular French nobleman, belief took hold that the answer lay within the holy relics associated with a long-deceased Christian saint. In the 11th century, specifically in the year 1095, a noble named Garin de Valois found himself afflicted with an intense bout of ergotism. Being a devout man, he embarked on a journey to the Church of St. Anthony, located in what is now France. There he knelt in prayer before the ancient remnants of the saint, earnestly pleading for divine intervention and healing. Astonishingly, his prayers were answered. Within a few days, the symptoms that had plagued him began to fade away. It is quite conceivable that Guérin's locality had been experiencing an outbreak of ergot poisoning, and his recovery coincided with his travel to an area where the grain supplies were not tainted. However, both he and those who heard of his tale attributed his miraculous healing solely to the relics of Saint Anthony of Egypt, an ancient Christian monk.
Motivated by his incredible recovery, Guérin, together with his father, established the Hospital Brothers of St. Anthony. This newly formed religious order went on to create a network of hospitals dedicated to those suffering from this enigmatic illness. Their efforts led to the malady acquiring a new moniker, St. Anthony's Fire. In their care, the brothers offered patients a serene place for recuperation. Crucially, they also provided a diet free from contaminated ergot, comprising wholesome meat and vegetables. This adjustment in diet alone often sufficed to aid patients with milder forms of the condition in their recovery. Additionally, the brothers concocted a unique healing wine, referred to as holy vintage. On the holy day of Ascension, this wine was filtered through the bones of St. Anthony and dispensed to the infirm. Although it may have provided solace to the spirit, no evidence ever emerged that this wine served as a cure. For those suffering severely, there remained only one confirmed method of treatment, albeit a harsh one: amputation. Surgically excising an affected limb was the sole way to halt the progress of gangrene and the subsequent bacterial infections that threatened the rest of the body. Unfortunately, if gangrene had already invaded a patient's internal organs, like the intestines, there was scant little the monks could do beyond offering comfort in their final, excruciating hours. It was not until the 17th century, a time marked by the infamous Salem Witch Trials, that practitioners at the Academy of Sciences in Paris began to unravel the scientific connection between St. Anthony's Fire and ergot-contaminated grain. Even though this groundbreaking discovery remained confined to scholarly circles and was not widely shared with the general populace or the colonies, cases continued to sporadically emerge across regions like France, Germany, and Switzerland. Physicians gradually observed that the repercussions of ergot poisoning extended beyond mere physical affliction to include effects on the psyche. There was a peculiar variant of St. Anthony's Fire, termed convulsive ergotism. Unlike its gangrenous counterpart, this form did not lead to gangrene. Rather, it brought about memory lapses, mental disarray, and other serious neurological issues. It is this convulsive strain of ergotism that may have fueled the haunting visions of witches and demons that tormented the inhabitants of Salem. Certain types of ergot produce a particular potent alkaloid called lysergic acid. In instances of convulsive ergotism, this lysergic acid directly targets and injures the central nervous system. Those affected endure violent seizures, memory decline, and intensely vivid hallucinations. This singular compound might explain why a young girl like Anne Putnam perceived not a feeble elderly woman in the courtroom, but a frightening specter of demonic origin. Indeed, lysergic acid is so formidable, so profoundly capable of altering perception, that it forms the chemical framework for a renowned synthetic hallucinogen, LSD. The tale of LSD kicks off back in 1938 in the quaint city of Basel, Switzerland. A young chemist by the name of Albert Hofmann, who was 32 at the time, found himself hard at work at Sandoz Laboratories. He was diving into a quest for a groundbreaking drug that could potentially serve as a respiratory stimulant. The researchers over at Sandoz had been delving into the mysterious world of ergot alkaloids due to their known ability to constrict blood vessels. They were convinced that a controlled version of this process could play a role in managing blood pressure efficiently. Hoffman's mission was to concoct and explore the possibilities of various derivatives of ergot. Over time, he managed to drum up 24 different compounds. However, none seemed to exhibit any promising effects on his lab animals until he stumbled upon the 25th. It was then that he married lysergic acid with a chemical named diethylamine. When Hoffman introduced this novel compound, dubbed LSD-25, to his animal subjects, they appeared to become uncharacteristically restless and overly excited. Nevertheless, it did not produce any noticeable changes in their breathing or circulation, leading the tests to be ceased. LSD-25 was ultimately labeled a failure and placed on the back burner. For almost 5 years, the folder on LSD-25 gathered dust, forgotten. Even as Hoffman pressed forward with his research, he found himself unable to shake off the memory of the peculiar effects it had on the behavior of his lab subjects. Thus, he chose to revisit it.
One afternoon in April of 1943, Hoffman produced a fresh batch of LSD-25. At some point during the day, he began to feel a wave of restlessness and dizziness wash over him. Assuming that he was just tired, he opted to call it a day and head home. But as he pedaled on his bicycle, that odd sensation grew stronger. Hours later, Hoffman found himself slipping into a daydream-like trance.
Reflecting on the experience, he described witnessing a continuous stream of marvelous images, extraordinary shapes with a dazzling kaleidoscope of colors playing out before him. Upon returning to the lab after a few days, he set out to identify the root of his unusual reaction. Methodically, he ruled out every other chemical he'd been handling. The sole suspect left was LSD-25. Though uncertain of how it had entered his system, perhaps through contact with his fingertips, he was certain it had triggered his hallucinations without harming him. Hoffman made a pivotal choice. He would deliberately test the drug on himself once more. On that fateful afternoon of April 19th, 1943, he discreetly mixed what he thought to be a tiny dose, 250 micrograms of LSD-25, with water and downed it. Within the hour, dizziness, anxiety, and vivid visual distortions took hold again. This time, the effects were significantly more intense than the initial accidental encounter. As the evening progressed and his hallucinations intensified, a looming fear gripped him. He fretted the drug might cause lasting damage to his brain. Amidst his panic, he pleaded with his neighbor to fetch him some milk, a customary folk treatment for poisoning. Yet when his kind-hearted neighbors showed up, Hoffman couldn't recognize his face. Instead, he perceived what he would later recount as a sinister witch donning a colorful mask. Convinced beyond doubt, he believed a demon had taken possession of his body, mind, and soul. Overwhelmed with terror and certain that he was on the brink of death, Albert Hoffman called upon a doctor. However, when the physician arrived and carried out an examination, he found nothing physically amiss. The young chemist's blood pressure, respiration, and pulse were all perfectly normal. It seemed the profound and terrifying effects of the drug were confined solely within his mind. There was nothing left for the doctor to do but wait for the LSD to run its course. This intense hallucinogenic experience spanned a full 2 days, although following that initial nightmarish episode, the visions began to lose their intensity. In hindsight, Hoffman would come to describe the latter part of his experience as relatively gentle and, at moments, even delightful. Recent advancements in scientific research have unveiled the intricate process that underlies such an experience. Lysergic acid diethylamide, commonly known as LSD, possesses a unique molecular makeup that allows it to attach itself strongly to the serotonin receptors in the brain. Serotonin plays a vital role as a neurotransmitter, essential for regulating mood, perceptions, and the sleep cycle. It is a major component in the brain's pleasure and reward mechanisms. When the molecule of LSD latches on to these receptors, the brain perceives it as an overwhelming surge of serotonin. This biochemical interruption is a single aspect of a far more complex sequence of events, which ultimately leads to diverse areas of the brain, typically disconnected, engaging in unexpected interactions. For example, the visual cortex, responsible for processing visual information, ordinarily receives signals only from the optical nerves.
Yet, influenced by LSD, it starts receiving input from various other brain regions, including those linked to memory and emotion. Effectively, the visual cortex begins to interpret visions from one's own mind, casting them onto reality as if they were tangible. The naturally occurring lysergic acid found within the ergot fungus is merely about 1/10 as potent as Hoffman's synthesized LSD.
Nonetheless, should the residents of Salem have been continually consuming minimal doses of this natural hallucinogen through their tainted daily grain, it is entirely plausible that similar, prolonged effects could have arisen. Such gradual, chronic intoxication might explain why afflicted individuals reported hallucinations resembling those in Hoffman's experiences, where commonplace neighbors transformed into twisted and sinister phantoms. These were the same hallucinations tragically acknowledged by the Salem Court of Oyer and Terminer as valid spectral evidence.
Additionally, Albert Hoffman discovered that an individual's mental state and emotional condition can greatly alter the nature of an LSD experience. He believed his terrifying first intentional dose in 1943 was greatly influenced by his own internal dread and anxiety channeling through his visual cortex. His otherwise gentle neighbor appeared as a malevolent witch due to his heightened panic, fearing a demonic presence. This notion of set and setting is notably significant.
The Puritans of Salem existed amidst constant tension, facing relentless stressors such as the harsh wilderness, recent outbreaks of smallpox, and an ongoing fierce conflict with the French and indigenous allies. It becomes evident how such a pervasive communal anxiety might have fueled dark, fearsome, ergot-induced hallucinations. Furthermore, their stringent religious doctrines already instilled the belief that the devil was a palpable adversary waiting for any misfortune to exploit. However, it might not have been just those accused who were experiencing the effects of ergot toxicity. It is conceivable that the contamination also impacted the minds of Salem's influential magistrates and jurors. Contemporary studies have found that LSD can significantly heighten an individual's suggestibility. This implies that someone under the influence of the substance is considerably more inclined to accept presented information as truth without scrutiny. A study featured in a 2015 edition of the Journal of Psychopharmacology discovered that participants given LSD possessed much more active imaginations than those receiving a placebo. When a researcher described a hypothetical scenario to them, the subjects under LSD described it with such vivid realism, as though they were perceiving it directly, rather than just envisioning it. This increased suggestibility might account for why the judges readily accepted the fantastical testimonies of the afflicted parties. In the years succeeding the trials, a considerable number of Salem locals confessed to having not thought clearly during that somber period. It appears that, in retrospect, there was an awareness that an external force had influenced their decision-making. In the year 1696, a former judge from those infamous trials, a man by the name of Samuel Sioux, composed and publicly delivered a poignant confession.
Within it, he admitted, we confess that we ourselves were not capable of understanding nor able to withstand the mysterious delusion of the powers of darkness and prince of the air. His choice of words is revealing, suggesting he felt as if he hadn't been acting under his own volition during that period. Another key figure, the Puritan minister John Hale, was initially a staunch supporter of the trials back in 1692.
However, with time, he grew remorseful and became a vocal critic, especially against the court's reliance on spectral evidence, going so far as to propose that the supposedly guilty witches were actually innocent. His reflections on the trials were published posthumously in 1702, featuring a particularly eerie passage. Describing the era's profound gloom, he wrote that they wandered as if in a fog, unable to discern their path.
While such expressions could be interpreted as mere eloquent apologies from men shackled by guilt, it's conceivable that Swell and Hale might have been alluding, perhaps subconsciously, to a more literal experience, a prolonged, shared hallucinogenic episode. After the witch trials, numerous participants claimed that Satan himself had played them like puppets. They truly believed their minds had been altered when they condemned their neighbors to their fate.
And if the real catalyst for such a state wasn't the Prince of Darkness himself, it might very well have been Ergot. Regrettably, there is no foolproof method to retroactively ascertain that ergot poisoning was the driving force behind the Salem Witch Trials. The tangible evidence has been swallowed by time. Yet Dr. Linda Caporal, in her groundbreaking study, unearthed evidence that extended well beyond a mere list of symptoms.
She purported to pinpoint precisely where Salem's ergot outbreak might have originated and why the particular circumstances of that year could have ignited the calamity that fractured the colony. Dr. Linda Quarrel contended that the ergot hypothesis didn't merely account for the symptoms. It also potentially resolved two of the most persistent questions surrounding the trials: why the frenzy over witches appeared so intensely concentrated around Salem, and why the entire phenomenon ceased as abruptly as it began.
Her investigations revealed that the known life cycle of the ergot fungus astonishingly mirrored the timeline of the Salem crisis. Through this perspective, the narrative of the Salem Witch Trials arguably commences not in the notorious year of 1692, but earlier in the spring of 1691. This is the season when dormant ergot kernels from the prior year begin to germinate, sending forth minuscule mushrooms.
These mushrooms release a multitude of spores, which can linger in the atmosphere for as long as 2 months. Notably, this springtime is precisely when the people of Salem customarily sowed their primary grain crop, rye. Importantly, town records from that period indicate that the summer of 1691 experienced unusually high rainfall and humidity, ideal environmental conditions for ergot spores to flourish and infest Salem's rye fields.
The grain harvested in August was stored for several months until winter, at which point it was ground into flour and used to bake bread and prepare other foods for the community. Thus, if there indeed was a widespread ergot contamination in Salem's fields during 1691, the injurious effects wouldn't manifest until the community began consuming that stored grain in December of 1691 or January of 1692.
In January of 1692, it was documented for the first time that Elizabeth Parris experienced the unsettling symptoms of being bewitched. From that point, the unraveling events fell into place. As the year moved along, these bizarre afflictions spread across Salem, intensifying by springtime. Notably, Ann Putnam started experiencing troubles towards the end of February.
By the time June arrived, There were reports that as many as 30 individuals had been afflicted, precisely what one might anticipate as more members of the community consumed the tainted grain supply. The escalating symptoms persisted through the summer. However, the summer of 1692 was marked by dryness, an environmental condition that wouldn't favor the growth of new ergot spores. The final case of alleged witchcraft was introduced before the court in the autumn of 1692.
When winter settled in, the peculiar symptoms that had plagued the accusers seemed to have disappeared. By then, they were consuming the fresh harvest of that year, which wasn't contaminated with ergot, suggesting that the toxin had likely purged itself from their bodies and minds. The theory that ergot was responsible for these events helps elucidate both the timeline of the trials and the curious geographical patterns that arose between those accused of witchcraft and their accusers.
An examination of the accusations would show a striking division. The overwhelming majority of witchcraft accusers were concentrated in a specific part of Salem. Out of the 32 adults who cast accusations, 30 of them resided on the rural western side, notably near the influential Putnam family farm. On the contrary, most of the accused and their defenders were based on the eastern side, closer to the more affluent Salem town. Summarizing these insights, Dr.
Caparel posits that the ergot contamination probably began on the village's western side, possibly originating from the Putnam farm itself. This farm was not only one of the largest in the vicinity, but it also included moist, swampy meadows adjacent to the river, perfect conditions for ergot cultivation. Consequently, it makes sense that individuals residing on the west side of town, particularly those who engaged in buying or trading food with the influential Putnam farm, suffered the most.
Among those were probably the young girls who primarily acted as accusers and were directly exposed to grain from the Putnam's supply. Elizabeth Parris and her cousin Abigail belonged to Samuel Parris's household, where the minister received 2/3 of his salary in the form of food and provisions from his congregation. There's substantial likelihood that part of this came from the Putnam farm.
Moreover, Ann Putnam, along with 2 other accusers, lived directly on that farm and certainly consumed the contaminated grain. Another notable accuser, 17-year-old Elizabeth Hubbard, was the niece of the local doctor, William Griggs, and resided in his household. Just as with the minister, Dr. Griggs received compensation for services using food, and evidence suggests Ann Putnam's mother was a frequent client. It's plausible that contaminated grain from the Putnams ended up as part of his family's diet.
In fact, some individuals even displayed symptoms after spending merely one night at the Putnam residence. Take, for example, a man named Joseph Bailey, who became briefly swept up in the trials after making a stop in Salem with his wife on their way to Boston. It is thought that they shared an evening meal with the Putnams, and during this dinner, Bailey might have ingested bread tainted with ergot.
As the couple continued their journey the next day, Bailey suddenly felt what he described as a heavy blow to his chest. He glanced up and spotted an unfamiliar woman observing him from afar. However, when he mentioned this sight to his wife, she insisted she saw no one for miles around. The encounter left Bailey deeply disturbed, but this was just the beginning, as it wasn't confined to a single illusion.
In the aftermath of their visit to Salem, he began to report unusual sensations skittering across his skin, almost as if he were perpetually being pinched by unseen entities. Yet, despite how persuasive this circumstantial evidence might appear, it is insufficient to conclusively assert that ergot was the sole driving force behind the Salem Witch Trials.
Critics of this theory rightly argue that there is no direct reference to ergot or any mention of failed crops in the meticulous town records from Salem during that era. Perhaps most significantly,
The most vital physical evidence that might have determined the validity of this theory one way or the other has vanished over the years. This lost evidence revolves around the Paris family's pet dog.
Caparel posits that one of the most neglected yet pivotal episodes of the entire crisis was the so-called witch cake experiment brought forth by a neighbor named Mary Sibley. Sibley contended that a particular folk tradition could reveal whether the girls were genuinely bewitched. This involved preparing a unique cake with one of the primary ingredients being rye meal, sourced from the Paris family's own supply. The cake was then to be fed to the family dog. The conclusive outcome of this test was never documented, but Dr. Caparel speculates that the test may have indeed succeeded, or at least seemed to. She deduces that the Paris family's canine did indeed suffer severe convulsions after consuming the witch cake, not due to any sinister sorcery, but because of the potent concentration of ergot alkaloids in the rye. Observing such a reaction, the townsfolk of Salem would have interpreted it as irrefutable evidence that the devil was indeed amongst them. This could also clarify why nobody dared to doubt the girls' statements in the subsequent year. A group of young girls might fabricate their symptoms and hallucinations, but everyone was aware that a dog could not. Caparel further observes that the town's judicial authorities only intervened formally in the affair following the witch cake experiment.
Therefore, whatever the results were, they must have been dramatic enough to instill fear in the entire community. In her urgent attempt to aid her neighbors, Mary Sibley might have unwittingly sparked the very hysteria that paved the way for the Salem Witch Trials. The last known significant outbreak of ergotism in the Western world took place centuries later, in 1951. It struck the quaint town of Pont-Saint-Esprit in southern France. More than 250 residents consumed bread contaminated with ergot. Many suffered from uncontrollable seizures, raging fevers, and intense nausea. Others endured vivid, horrifying hallucinations. Over 50 inhabitants were reportedly institutionalized. An 11-year-old boy attempted to strangle his mother. A man sustained serious injuries after leaping from a second-story window, claiming he was an airplane, and at least 5 individuals perished. Fortunately, today's modern farming practices employ a range of advanced techniques to fight against ergot infestations.
The use of fungicides and advanced crop rotation strategies helps to prevent outbreaks from spreading. Nevertheless, ergot continues to pose a considerable danger to rural farming communities in certain other regions across the globe. India experienced a significant outbreak as recently as 1975. Then, in 2001, Ethiopia faced a widespread occurrence. Even now, the pursuit to finally wipe out this age-old fungal nemesis marches on.
Regardless of what truly instigated the Salem Witch Trials, that episode left an indelible mark on both the Massachusetts colony and the trajectory of what would become the United States. Some historians suggest that the terror of 1692 signaled the beginning of the demise of Puritan dominance in America. Before those infamous trials, zealous Puritans held the reins of the colonial government, frequently practicing discrimination against religious minorities. Yet, post-Salem, this supremacy began to unravel.
The frenzied and baseless accusations, along with the pointless executions, served as a stark and terrifying example for critics of the perils of theocratic rule. Even King William III of England personally supervised the introduction of new policies within the Massachusetts Bay Colony. These policies intended to strip the Puritan leaders, whose governance had been tainted with severe religious intolerance, of their power. This ingrained colonial fear of a theocratic regime eventually birthed one of the core tenets of the United States Constitution, the division between church and state. Up to this day, the Salem Witch Trials continue to be cloaked in enigma. We may never definitively determine whether the disaster was set off by ergotism, by rampant mass hysteria, or by plain deceit.
What we can discern, however, is that it was a blaze sustained by paranoia, apprehension, and a steadfastly rigid belief system. In their dread, the residents of Salem unjustly devastated the lives of numerous neighbors. The true sufferers of this dreadful episode were not the girls who claimed affliction, but rather the 19 individuals executed and the countless others who perished in custody.
They became casualties due to a community ensnared by the dread of the devil, which led them to believe a gathering of witches threatened to dismantle their lives. Tragically and ironically, they were correct in a sense. The occurrences of that year did indeed signal the end of their familiar world.
The Salem Witch Trials stand as a chilling testament to how easily the human psyche can be swayed, whether through poison, psychological influences, or sheer paranoia, towards a path of ruin. It is a grim chapter in our collective past, one that continues to both captivate and caution us. If you have the curiosity to discover more of these bygone tales, remember to stay tuned.
As we delve further into the murky areas where science and the inexplicable converge, there are many more stories waiting to be unveiled.